If the Poppy War, the Priory of the Orange Tree, Fourth Wing, and A Court of Thorns and Roses can all be described as Romantasy, then Romantasy no longer tells us what kind of book we're about to read. Those books may all contain fantasy and some form of romantic attraction, but they do not treat those elements in remotely the same way. In one, the central relationship is one of the main reasons the series exists. In another, romance is meaningful but remains one part of a much larger epic. And in others, romance is so unimportant to the actual story that calling the book Romantasy feels less like flexible genre classification and more like setting a reader up for a deeply confusing experience. At some point, a category becomes so broad that it stops helping anyone, and I think Romantasy has kind of reached that point. Genre labels aren't supposed to describe every ingredient contained inside of a book. They're supposed to help us understand which ingredients define it. A fantasy novel does not become a mystery novel because the protagonist spends 3 chapters investigating a murder, and a science fiction story doesn't automatically become a romance because 2 characters kiss before boarding a spaceship. Most stories contain elements associated with several genres, but we classify them according to their central promises. What drives the plot, what receives the most narrative attention, and what kind of resolution the reader is being prepared for. When picking up a murder mystery, a reader reasonably expects the mystery to be more than a brief inconvenience between unrelated events. When a book is sold to someone as a romantasy, they expect the romance and the fantasy to be equal central to the experience. That doesn't mean that they necessarily have to receive exactly the same amount of pages, because stories are not spreadsheets and nobody should be calculating the percentage of dialogue dedicated to flirting. It just means that both elements should be structurally important. The fantasy conflict should shape the relationship should affect the fantasy conflict, and removing either one should fundamentally change the book. If the romantic storyline could disappear while leaving the protagonist's primary motivation, central conflict, and the ending mostly intact, then I would probably describe that book as a fantasy with a romantic subplot. That's not an insult or a lesser category. In many cases, it's exactly what I prefer to read. It's just a different promise from a story in which the relationship is one of the main engines moving everything forward. Books like A Court of Thorns and Roses, Fourth Wing, and Quicksilver make sense to me under the Romantasy label, even though they don't all balance their 2 genres precisely the same way. The romantic relationships are not incidental additions that occasionally appear between major plot events. They occupy a central place in the protagonist's emotional journey, shape major decisions, and they provide a substantial part of the tensions readers are following. People don't recommend ACOTAR while treating its relationship as a minor detail best left out of the description. The romance is embedded in the identity of the series. Fourth Wing combines its military academy, dragons, and larger political revelations with a relationship that's clearly designed as one of the book's primary sources of suspense. Quicksilver similarly expects the reader to care about both its fantasy conflict and the central romantic dynamic. You can debate how successfully any of these books execute both of those elements, but the category itself communicates something useful about their priorities. The same label communicates something very different when it's attached to the Priory of the Orange Tree. That book contains romantic relationships, and those relationships matter to the characters involved, but it is a large multi-perspective epic fantasy concerned with political division, religion, competing versions of history, and an existential threat that exists far beyond any couple. The romance contributes emotional weight, but it doesn't define the overall structure of the novel. A reader could discuss the main conflict, the world, and the majority of the principal characters without necessarily treating one central romance as the destination around which everything else has been built. Calling Priory Romantasy doesn't make the book more inclusive or accessible. It just encourages readers to approach it with expectations that the book might not satisfy. Hi, I'm Sleepless, and I spend a lot of my free time reading fantasy, playing games, and then thinking far too much about how all of those things are categorized, marketed, and recommended. I generally prefer fantasy, in which romance remains a subplot, but that preference only works if the description of a book gives me an honest sense of how much space the romance occupies. I'm not trying to argue that one category is better than the other, or that authors should be forced to select a perfectly precise label before they're permitted to publish. I just want Romantasy to provide more information. Blood Over Bright Haven is another good example of why that distinction matters. It is one of my 5-star reads of this year, and it contains an important relationship between its central characters, but I would not call it Romantasy. Its real focus is on industrial power, discrimination, on knowledge, on ambition, and the systems that decide who is allowed to participate in intellectual life. The relationship develops through that conflict and adds emotional complexity, but the book does not organize itself around the romantic arc. Someone approaching it primarily for romance may spend most of the book waiting for it to become a different story. Someone approaching it as a fantasy about power, prejudice, and the cost of discovery is way closer to what the book is actually offering them. Then there's the Poppy War, which I've seen described as a romantasy in online recommendations, despite being so extraordinarily far from it. I would hesitate even to call romance a meaningful subplot in that series. It's a brutal military fantasy dealing with war, imperialism, genocide, vengeance, and destruction caused by power. Whatever interpersonal tension readers may identify with between particular characters does not transform the series into a romantic narrative. Calling it romantasy because viewers who enjoy fantasy romance might also enjoy it confuses audience overlap with genre. The same person can like both Fourth Wing and the Poppy War, just as someone can enjoy horror films and romantic comedies. But one person enjoying two different things doesn't make those things the same genre. That confusion happens frequently on BookTok because recommendations are often built around communities rather than definitions. A creator knows their audience enjoyed one popular fantasy book, so they recommend another fantasy book that produced a similar emotional reaction, has a dramatic relationship, or shares part of the same readership. Eventually, books romantasy readers may enjoy becomes romantasy books. Because the second phrase is shorter, more searchable, and easier for an algorithm to understand. The label stops describing the structure of the story and starts describing the group of people most likely to buy it. That may be useful for reaching an audience, but it's not very useful for the person trying to decide what the book actually is. The confusion becomes even clearer with Throne of Glass. It was written by Sarah J. Maas, who also wrote ACOTAR, and the association encourages people to place both series in the same category. But authors are allowed to write different kinds of books. Throne of Glass contains several significant romantic relationships, and those relationships change across a long series. But its larger identity is an epic fantasy. Its plot expands through kingdoms, wars, magical history, political alliances, and an ensemble whose importance is not dependent on participation in the central romance. The existence of beloved couples doesn't override the structure surrounding them. If every fantasy series with prominent relationships becomes romantasy, then a huge portion of modern fantasy suddenly belongs to the category, and we're left without a useful way to distinguish romance-led stories from fantasy stories that simply allow their characters to fall in love. Publishers and booksellers have obvious reasons to embrace this confusion. Romantasy is commercially powerful, immediately recognizable, and capable of gathering books into displays that attract an active readership. If applying the label increases visibility, there's little incentive to reserve it for books that fit a narrower definition. A fantasy novel with a striking relationship can be positioned beside established romantasy successes, even if the structure is completely different. Online stores make the category even more elastic because a book can appear under several tags at once, and those tags are often designed to maximize discovery rather than provide literary precision. The term gradually changes from a genre into a marketing environment. There's no need for a conspiracy here. Publishers are trying to sell books, booksellers are trying to place them where interested readers will see them, and online creators are just trying to describe them in a language their audience recognizes. Each individual use of the label can seem reasonable, but collectively they stretch it until almost any fantasy novel with romantic context qualifies. The result ends up being a category that promises radically different experiences depending on who happens to be using it. To one person, romantasy means romance in a fantasy setting. To another, it means epic fantasy with a prominent relationship. To someone else, it might mean that the book requires spice and some sort of explicit content. The difficulty is that romantasy has never had universally enforced boundaries. It emerged as a convenient combination of two genres, and hybrid genres will always exist on a spectrum. Some books will sit directly in the middle, while others lean strongly towards romance or fantasy. That flexibility is not inherently a weakness. The problem is that we rarely acknowledge where a particular particular book sits on that spectrum. Everything is placed beneath one increasingly crowded label, leaving the reader to discover the balance after buying it. A more useful vocabulary would distinguish between romance-forward romantasy, balanced romantasy, and a fantasy with a romantic subplot. We don't need an official governing body to inspect every manuscript and issue certification. We just need descriptions that identify narrative priority. If the central relationship is the main emotional destination and the fantasy plot is deeply intertwined with it, romantasy is useful. If the fantasy and romance carry roughly equal structural weight, the label is equally appropriate. If the romance enriches the characters but the central story would continue without it, fantasy with some romance is more accurate. These phrases are slightly less convenient than using one popular word for everything, but they do tell the readers far more. The ending also matters, because romance as a genre creates particular expectations. Readers generally expect the central relationship to move towards some form of emotionally satisfying resolution, even if that resolution is delayed across a series. Fantasy doesn't make the same promise. It may contain a love story that ends in separation, death, betrayal, or permanent uncertainty, because the romantic arc is serving a different central narrative. When we apply the romantasy label to both, we blur not only how much romance a book contains, but what function that romance is expected to perform. A tragic relationship inside an epic fantasy can be excellent, but a reader who was promised a romance-led story may very reasonably feel that the book broke its contract. This confusion also creates unfair criticism. A fantasy novel with a subplot gets criticized because the romance was too limited, even though the relationship was never intended to carry the book. A romance-forward fantasy gets criticized because the external conflict didn't receive the depth expected from an epic fantasy, even though its primary objective was always the relationship. Readers end up arguing about quality when they may actually be responding to incompatible expectations created before the first page. Clearer labels would not guarantee that everyone likes the book, but at least we would be judging it according to the experience it intended to provide. If you've ever encountered a book that was sold or recommended to you as a romantasy and it turned out to be something completely different, please tell me which one in the comments. I'm especially curious about where you personally draw the line between fantasy and romantasy, because I don't think everyone will agree that romance and fantasy need to be equally central to the story. Perhaps together we can prevent someone from opening the Poppy War and spending 3 books waiting for the romance to begin. None of this is about gatekeeping readers. Calling the Priory of the Orange Tree epic fantasy instead of romantasy doesn't prevent romantasy readers from enjoying it. Calling Throne of Glass fantasy with substantial romance doesn't diminish the importance of its relationships. And saying that the Poppy War is not romantasy should be considered basic public safety and not some sort of controversy. Categories are not fences telling us what we are allowed to read. They're signs helping us understand what lies ahead in the story. Romantasy can be a meaningful label. It can identify stories where 2 powerful narrative traditions genuinely depend on each other, where the relationship changes the fate of the fantasy world and the fantasy conflict makes the relationship possible. It can help readers find exactly the combination they love and help authors reach people who are looking for it. But it can only do that if we allow some fantasy books with romance to not be romantasy. A genre label that includes everything ultimately explains nothing. And if the only qualifications for romantasy is that a fantasy character experiences romantic feelings at some point, then we've not created a useful new genre. We simply renamed most of fantasy.